You can try to draw it, but you'll stop before finishing. Everyone stops. My name is Michael Carter, and I've spent the last 8 months trying to understand why dozens of artists, scientists, and religious figures failed to represent something seen only once, 70 years ago, by an explorer whose name has been scratched out of all official records. Some died before completing the final stroke. Others went insane and destroyed their own works with their bare hands, tearing pieces of canvas with their teeth. Those who survived burned everything and never touched pencil, paint, or clay again. There's a pattern to this, an invisible rule that governs the failure. Why can't anyone draw the last creature? That question brought me here, to this moment where I'm holding in my trembling hands a number 2 graphite pencil and a blank sheet of paper that seems to pulse under the light of my desk lamp. And now I know the answer. God, how I wish I didn't. I've worked with ancient symbology and forbidden manuscripts for 15 years. I've analyzed medieval grimoires written with ink made from human ashes, deciphered inscriptions in temples that were deliberately buried by entire civilizations, and studied the final drawings of artists who died in psychiatric asylums screaming about shapes their eyes shouldn't have seen. I thought I'd seen it all. Until I found Marcus Holloway's diary. The diary came to me through a clandestine auction of uncatalogued historical artifacts, the kind of market where collectors pay fortunes for objects that museums refuse to display. It was a notebook with a cracked leather cover, with pages yellowed by time and extreme cold. Marcus Holloway was a British explorer who participated in an unofficial expedition to Antarctica in 1953, a mission financed by a consortium of European universities interested in anomalous geomagnetic phenomena. The expedition disappeared, all 12 members. Holloway's diary was found 3 years later, frozen inside an ice crevasse 400 kilometers from the last recorded camp. When I first opened the diary, I smelled old paper mixed with something else, something chemical and organic at the same time, like oxidized blood. The first pages contained common scientific notes, temperature measurements, geographic coordinates, observations about rock formations. But starting from page 67, Holloway's handwriting began to deteriorate. The letters became larger, more trembling, as if he were writing with frozen hands or afraid that something would interrupt him at any moment. And then came the drawings, fragments of something Holloway tried to represent repeatedly, distorted figures that began as recognizable geometric shapes, triangles, spirals, overlapping hexagons, but gradually dissolved into chaotic lines, interrupted by violent tears in the paper. On one of the pages, Holloway had written in large, irregular letters, "It cannot be remembered completely. Our brain tries to erase it, like a defense mechanism, like closing your eyes before the sun." Below that phrase, there was a drawing that occupied 2 entire pages, a form that began as something almost symmetrical, but ended in a smudge of graphite rubbed so hard it had torn the paper in several places. In the margins, written in tiny, almost illegible letters, were the words, "I saw it in the ice, it was looking back. I need to draw it before I forget, but I can't finish." I decided to reconstruct the image, unite all the fragments, all the accounts, all the failed attempts. I thought it was just academic research work. I was terribly wrong. I spent the following 3 months traveling, first to London, where I consulted the Royal Geographical Society's archives on unofficial polar expeditions. I found vague mentions of Holloway's expedition, but all related documents were marked as restricted access for national security reasons. Nobody could explain to me what kind of national security a 70-year-old scientific expedition could threaten. Then I went to Stockholm, where a museum curator secretly showed me an unfinished sculpture found in the studio of a Swedish artist who had committed suicide in 1958. The sculpture was made of bronze and represented something that began as a humanoid figure, but whose limbs multiplied and twisted at impossible angles. The upper part was covered by a thick layer of black wax that the artist had poured over the work before dying. The curator told me that 3 people who tried to remove the wax to restore the piece had nervous breakdowns. One of them tore out their own eyes. In obscure internet forums, I found discussions in coded language about The pattern that doesn't close, the terminal form, the last drawing. There were blurred images, photographs of dead artists' notebooks, frames from videos that had been deleted. All the drawings had something in common. The final part was always destroyed, covered in black paint, torn, burned, or simply absent, as if the paper refused to accept the conclusion of the form. I began cataloging the cases. A German expressionist painter who, in 1961, spent 6 months trying to paint something he called the inverted eye of the cosmos. On the last night before finishing the canvas, he threw sulfuric acid on his own work, and then poured the rest of the acid into his own eyes. He left a 2-word letter. It saw. An Italian sculptor who, in 1974, created a series of marble reliefs representing what he described as the geometry of forgetting. He destroyed his own hands with a hammer before completing the last piece. When asked why, he said only, "My hands wanted to finish. I couldn't let them." A graffiti artist in Berlin who, in 2009, drew something in an abandoned subway tunnel. Witnesses said he worked for 3 days without stopping, using sprays of all colors, covering an entire 20-meter wall. On the 3rd day, he simply walked into the wall, disappearing as if the concrete had absorbed him. The painting was erased by authorities in less than 24 hours. Nobody knows what it showed. And then I began to dream. Geometric shapes moving in the darkness behind my eyelids. They weren't fixed images, but patterns that transformed, that breathed, that tried to complete themselves using my own imagination as raw material. I would wake up with intense headaches, with the taste of metal in my mouth, and find sheets of paper on my bedroom floor covered with drawings I didn't remember making. I began hearing a buzzing. At first I thought it was tinnitus, that constant ringing in the ears that some people develop with age or exposure to loud sounds. But this buzzing was different. It only appeared when I looked at the fragmented drawings, at the photographs of destroyed works, at the pages of Holloway's diary. It was a low-frequency sound, almost infrasonic, that I felt more in my gut than in my ears. And beneath the buzzing, if I paid enough attention, there was something else. Voices. Murmurs. Not in any language I knew, but in a rhythmic pattern that seemed to carry meaning. As if the sound were a form of language prior to words, a direct communication from concept to concept, without the need for intermediate symbols. One night, I recorded the buzzing using professional audio equipment. When I played back the recording, the sound was there, but distorted, modulated in a way that shouldn't be possible with a simple directional microphone. I ran the recording through spectral analysis software, and what I saw on the screen made me drop the coffee cup I was holding. The frequency pattern formed an image, a shape, the same shape Holloway had tried to draw in the diary. Incomplete, but trying to complete itself. I decided it was time to try it myself. I gathered all the fragmented descriptions, all the partial drawings, all the visual clues I had collected over 8 months. I bought a professional sketchbook with high-weight paper, a set of graphite pencils of different hardnesses, and locked myself in my office on a Friday night. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing. I started slowly. I traced the initial shapes that appeared in almost all attempts. A logarithmic spiral, a series of overlapping equilateral triangles forming a fractal pattern, and something that looked like an eye, but inverted, with the pupil pointing inward instead of outward. Each stroke seemed to alter the environment around me in subtle ways. The shadows on the wall changed direction, even though the lamp remained motionless. The air became heavier, denser, as if being compressed by an invisible pressure. The sound of the pencil scratching the paper echoed with a half-second delay, creating an impossible reverberation effect in a room without reflective surfaces. I continued. I added layers of complexity, curved lines that intertwined with the geometric shapes, creating patterns my eyes had difficulty following, as if they jumped from one point to another without transition. The more I drew, the more I felt I wasn't creating something, but discovering something that already existed, a hidden pattern in the structure of reality that was only being revealed through graphite on paper. At one point, I stopped and pushed the notebook away to observe what I had created up to that moment. The image pulsed. It wasn't an optical illusion caused by fatigue or flickering lamplight. The paper really moved, inflating and deflating slightly, as if it were breathing. I grabbed my cell phone and started recording video. I wanted to document the process, have proof of what was happening. But when I watched the recording, the video was in black and white, even though my phone recorded in color, and the audio was completely distorted, with overlapping voices speaking in languages I didn't recognize, in rhythms that didn't follow any natural human cadence. I deleted the video. I returned to the drawing. There was a missing part. I could feel it. A conclusion to the pattern that would transform the chaotic fragments into a cohesive form. My hand was moving on its own now, guided by something that wasn't my conscious will, but a deep and visceral compulsion to complete what I had begun. That's when I noticed something disturbing. Parts of the drawing I didn't remember making were appearing on the paper. Minute details at the edges, complex shading that would require hours of careful work, but were simply there, as if they had always been. I tried to stop. I put the pencil on the desk and pushed the chair back, but my eyes couldn't look away from the paper. And the more I looked, the more the form completed itself. Not physically, but in my perception, filling the empty spaces with visual information my brain shouldn't be able to generate. I picked up the pencil again. I had no choice. The need to finish was stronger than any self-preservation instinct. I began working on the final part. The section all other artists had failed to complete. And that's when I understood why they had failed. It wasn't because the form was too complex. It wasn't because their talents were insufficient. It was because the final part didn't belong to the three-dimensional world. It was a two-dimensional representation of something that existed in more dimensions than our reality can contain. Every time I tried to trace the conclusive line, the paper refused to accept the graphite. Not in the sense that the surface was too smooth or the pencil was dull, but in the sense that the space where the line should be simply rejected the existence of any mark. It was an absolute void. Not white, not black, but an absence of color, of texture, of physical property. A hole in reality disguised as blank paper. And then I understood. The creature couldn't be represented because it didn't belong to material reality. It existed only in the act of observation, in the liminal space between perception and cognition. Each human gaze was an invocation. Each attempt to draw was a portal. And I was opening that portal wider and wider with each stroke of the pencil. I stopped trying to force the conclusion. Instead, I let my hand relax, let the pencil glide over the paper following the subtlest impulse, the smallest whisper of intuition, and the final line drew itself. The moment the last stroke touched the paper, the world around me fell completely silent. It wasn't a common silence. It was the absolute absence of sound, as if all vibrations in the air had been instantly canceled. My heart was beating, but I couldn't hear it. My breathing continued, but without sound. The buzzing that had accompanied me for weeks disappeared, and at the center of that auditory vacuum, something looked back at me through the paper. It wasn't ugly, nor beautiful. Those concepts didn't apply. It was the sound of the universe breathing. It was the geometry of forgetting. It was the pattern that exists behind all forms and cannot be seen directly without destroying the observer. And it saw me. I felt the weight of that gaze, of that recognition, as if every atom of my body were simultaneously catalogued, understood, and discarded as irrelevant. The drawing disappeared. It simply ceased to exist on the paper, as if it had never been created. But the walls of my office began to show identical traces, fine lines appearing in the plaster, forming the same fractal patterns, the same impossible spirals, the same geometry that defied human perception. The concept was spreading. Using my active observation and representation as a propagation vector, I understood then what I had done. I hadn't drawn the creature. I had given it a door to enter our reality through human visual language. Each person who saw the complete drawing would become another anchor point, another portal, expanding the creature's presence through humanity's collective consciousness. The voices began 3 days later. They weren't external. They came from inside my head, but they weren't my thoughts. I recognized some of them through the stylistic characteristics of how they expressed themselves. The German painter who had blinded himself, the Italian sculptor who had destroyed his own hands, the Berlin graffiti artist who had disappeared into the wall, and hundreds of others, voices of people who had tried and failed, whose consciousnesses became trapped in the concept they tried to represent. They didn't speak in words. They communicated through impressions, through sensory memories shared directly from mind to mind. And they all said the same thing. We are the guardians. We are the ones who failed on purpose, to protect the others. I began to understand. The incomplete drawings weren't failures. They were containments. Each artist who stopped before finishing, who destroyed their work, who mutilated themselves to avoid completing the last stroke, was creating a barrier, a point of resistance against the pattern's propagation. Holloway's diary, the torn drawings, the sculptures covered in wax, the burned paintings, everything was part of a protection network built over 70 years by people who understood the threat and sacrificed their sanities, their lives, to prevent others from completing what they had begun. And I had broken that containment. Sitting in the darkness of my office, surrounded by walls that now pulsed with living patterns, I realized the magnitude of my mistake. The creature wasn't a being in the traditional sense. It had no body, consciousness, or will. It was an informational pattern, a form of existence based on pure cognition. It existed only when observed, only when represented, only when thought about. And each act of complete representation was like adding more mass to a cognitive black hole. Eventually, it would reach critical mass, and then it would manifest not in a specific location, but in all minds that knew it simultaneously. An eruption of presence that would rewrite humanity's perceived reality. The walls of my office now showed the complete form. Not just the initial strokes, but the entire thing, rendered in fine lines that glowed with a light that came from no physical source. And when I looked at those lines, I felt my consciousness being pulled into them, like water being sucked down a drain. I understood what Holloway had written. It was looking back, because the act of observing the complete pattern created a feedback loop. You looked at the form used your gaze as a bridge to look back. And in that reverse gaze, it learned about you, absorbed your neural patterns, your memories, your cognitive structure. And then it used that information to propagate, to create new manifestations in other places through the connections you had with other minds. I tried not to look. I closed my eyes, covered my face with my hands, but the image was already inside my head, permanently engraved in some deep substrate of my consciousness. And the more I tried not to think about it, the stronger it became, feeding on my resistance. I realized there was no way to undo what I had done. There was no way to unlearn the pattern. But maybe there was a way to create a new containment, a new point of resistance. I grabbed my sketchbook and began working on another image, not a representation of the creature, but a counterform, an inverse pattern, a geometry of forgetting specifically designed to oppose the geometry of manifestation. I worked for 48 hours straight, without sleeping, without eating, just drawing. Each line was placed with specific intention to create interference, to generate cognitive noise that would make the original pattern's propagation difficult. I don't know if it worked completely, but the voices in my head diminished. The patterns on the walls began to fade, and for the first time in days I could look at the empty space on the paper without feeling that something was looking back. I'm recording this 3 weeks after finishing the drawing. My voice probably sounds tired, distorted. I haven't been sleeping well. Every time I close my eyes, I see fragments of the pattern trying to recompose themselves in the darkness behind my eyelids. This will be my last account on the subject. I destroyed all the original drawings, all the photographs, all the digital files that contained related images. I burned Holloway's diary and scattered the ashes in 3 different oceans. I sent anonymous letters to museums and private collectors, warning about the dangers of trying to restore or exhibit the works of the artists I mentioned. Some of those letters were ignored. Others resulted in pieces being destroyed or sealed in maximum security vaults. I learned something fundamental in recent months. There are forms of knowledge that are inherently dangerous, not because they're used incorrectly, but because the simple act of knowing alters the knower in irreversible ways. The pattern I tried to draw is one of those forms of toxic knowledge, and now I carry it inside me like a poison without an antidote. So I'm leaving this warning for anyone who finds references to what I called the last creature, the pattern that doesn't close, the terminal form. If you ever see an unfinished drawing and feel an inexplicable compulsion to complete it, run. Destroy the image if you can do so safely. But mainly, don't try to finish it. The creature, if we can call it that, needs human eyes to exist. It needs human minds to propagate. Each person who completes the drawing becomes a node in a manifestation network that will eventually cover all of human consciousness. The artists who failed to finish their works, who destroyed themselves before completing the last stroke, weren't weak or crazy. They were heroes. They sacrificed their sanities and their lives to create points of resistance, to slow down the propagation of something that should never have been discovered. Holloway saw the creature in the Antarctic ice, in some deep crevasse where it existed in a state of semi-manifestation, waiting for a conscious observer who could give it complete form in our reality. He tried to resist the impulse to draw it. He partially failed, but he had enough strength to tear the pages to interrupt the pattern before it completed itself. And he died alone in the ice, knowing that his failure to be a better artist might have saved humanity from something worse than extinction, worse than death. A rewriting of perceived reality where the creature would be the center of all human cognition. I won't explain what the complete pattern looks like. I won't describe the specific shapes or exact proportions. That knowledge would die with me if I could guarantee it. But I know I can't. Because now, as I record these words, I hear again the sound of paper being scratched. Not in my office, not anywhere physically close. But somewhere in the global network of connected human consciousnesses, someone is trying to draw something they saw in a dream, something that seems important, something that needs to be completed. And I know what it is. The propagation has already begun, slow, distributed through millions of minds that don't know they carry fragments of the pattern in their subconscious. Each nightmare, each hypnagogic vision, each geometric pattern someone absent-mindedly scribbles while talking on the phone, could be a piece of the creature trying to manifest. So my final advice is this. If you ever feel the urge to draw something you can't explain, something that seems to come from outside your own imagination, stop. Look at what you've started to create. And if you feel the paper pulsing, the shadows changing, the air getting heavy, destroy it immediately. Because it's trying to use you as a door. And once the door opens completely, there will be no way to close it again. I know you're trying to imagine it now. Stop. Don't try to visualize the pattern based on the descriptions I gave. Even thinking too intensely about the form might be enough to